Emerson is associated with the Transcendentalist movement in American literature. In fact, for many, he is the primary Transcendentalist thinker. Other famous Transcendentalists would be Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller. Well, what does it mean to be a Transcendentalist? The Transcendentalists were not just these three, there were many others included in the group. There really was no unifying idea behind American Transcendentalism other than, according to Emerson in an essay from 1842 called The Transcendentalist, other than an espousal of the primary idea of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is essential for understanding Emerson, indeed essential for understanding American Romanticism as a whole, understanding British Romanticism as a whole. Kant, living in Königsberg, read the work of Hume, David Hume, the great British empiricist. And he saw that for Hume, if we can only gain knowledge through sense perception, then at any given moment when an object is, say, falling from a height to the ground, we can only see that object sensually. We are unable to perceive gravity. So basically the belief that gravity pushes a rock from a cliff down to the ocean is simply a belief that there's something called gravity because we cannot perceive gravity. We can only perceive that rock at every instant it is falling down to the water. So this roused Kant from his dogmatic slumbers, as he said. He was basically a full-on idealist, rationalist before this, deep into Spinoza and Leibniz, people like that. He says, I'm awakened from my dogmatic slumbers. I need to find a way to preserve science. To preserve science, there must be a way that we can make claims about forces like gravity that are valid. So what does he do? He ultimately says that, yes, in a way, Hume is right. When I look at the world with my senses, I cannot gain any sense of causality. I cannot perceive causality. I cannot perceive gravity caused that rock to fall to the ground. What do I do then? Kant says, I will now conduct a Copernican revolution in philosophy. You know where causality comes from? You know where time comes from? Space, quantity, quality? From inside the mind. That is where causality comes from. So when I see the rock falling from the cliff, my senses can't see gravity, but my mind has the whole idea of causality within it. And because of that, I can make claims about the causality of gravity pushing this rock down. Kant called these parts of the mind categories. Mental framework that shapes experience into structures that make the world understandable. So suddenly, it's not that we must conform to the world through our senses, as Hume and Locke suggested, but the world conforms to us, to our brains. And Kant called these categories transcendental. So Coleridge in England was deep in Kant. Kant published Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. Coleridge was reading Kant assiduously in the early years of the 19th century, and he transformed Kant's ideas to his own sense of how the mind works and how the imagination works. And Emerson was deep in Coleridge primarily. He had read Kant, but mainly got his Kant through Coleridge. So in the Transcendentalists, Emerson says that the core belief of the Transcendentalists is that the mind shapes experience, that the mind is the primary organ for measuring truth, that we do not conform to the world sensually, the world conforms to our mental categories. As far as Emerson is concerned, that is the unifying concept of all the Transcendentalists. Now, in 1842, for Emerson, this was a metaphysical claim. Obviously, you can't prove scientifically that we have these categories in our mind. One just assumes they are there, that they are necessary for any kind of valid scientific claim. What happens is, for Emerson in 1842, almost right around the time he publishes this essay, his young boy, Waldo, dies of scarlet fever at the age of 5. Emerson had already been hit hard by tragedy when Ellen Tucker died in 1831. Also, two of his brothers, Charles and Edward, had died in the early 1830s as well of tuberculosis. Terrible tragedy. Emerson did remarry a woman named Lydia. And he loved his little boy, called him Wally. Wally dies. And this, like Ellen's death, causes a shift in Emerson. If Ellen's death, I'm not going to say inspired, if Ellen's death became the occasion for Emerson to start questioning his Unitarian beliefs and move more toward what we can call a kind of scientific idealism, the idea that the way to get to the spirit is through studying nature. If Ellen's death was the occasion for that, little Waldo's death was the occasion for another shift in Emerson from what I'm going to call an epistemological metaphysics to a pragmatic metaphysics. Yes, you can say that the mind shapes experience, and that is how we know the world, even if I can't prove these transcendental categories in my mind. That's the basic Kantian take. Well, Emerson throws all that off in his essay Experience from 1844, which is a long elegy in some ways for his little boy Wally. And in Experience, Emerson ultimately says, yes, the mind can still shape experience, but not in any way that gives us certainty. The mind can shape experience insofar as we can choose what we want to believe in, insofar as we can choose what we want to pay attention to, but ultimately we can't make any claim that is true for all time. We can make claims that are provisionally true. We can make claims that are temporarily true. And the claims that are true, let's say true with a little t, are the claims that help us negotiate the difficult, tragic world with a degree of grace. The difficult, tragical world doesn't stay the same, though. It changes. And as the world changes, our interpretation of that world must also change. So there's still a sense that the mind shapes experience, but not in some kind of grand metaphysical way, but in a very pragmatic, practical, down on the earth sort of way, where we're trying to make sense of the chaos that is physical experience. And we can do that, but our minds have to be nimble and quick and open and always ready to shift, to change.